On the night of January 31st, 1977, a 24-year-old woman in San Jose, California, went out with her friends to a bar on Almaden Road called the Lion's Den. She was young and she was social, and that kind of evening was not unusual for her. Somewhere before midnight, she met a man. Her friends watched her leave with him. She told them she would be back in 10 minutes. She was never seen alive again. The next morning, February 1st, her Volkswagen Beetle was found in the carport area of an apartment complex near the bar. She was inside it. Wedged tightly into the back seat, a long-sleeved dress shirt was tied around her neck. She had been strangled, and she had been sexually assaulted. And the man who had done it had tried to set the car on fire to destroy what he left behind. The fire failed to catch. The evidence survived, and a thumbprint on a cigarette carton sitting inside that car would wait 48 years to say his name. Before we go any further, there's something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed yet, and perhaps that wouldn't matter so much if these stories were just words. But they're not. They're pieces of real people, real families, real years that passed in silence while someone else went on living. So if you found meaning, or even a little bit of yourself, in these stories, please take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free, and it helps this community continue. And while you're here, tell me something in the comments. What is the one memory you find yourself returning to over and over again? Her name was Jeanette Ralston. She was 24 years old and lived in San Mateo, about 30 miles up the peninsula from San Jose. She had a son. His name was Alan, and he was 6 years old on the night his mother went out and did not come home. 6 years old is young enough that the years ahead would not give him clarity so much as distance. The kind of distance a child grows into without choosing it, shaped by the absence of something he barely had time to know. What he had of Jeanette was the memory of 6 years. What he carried after that was the fact of what happened to her, and 48 years of a case with no name attached to it. San Jose, in January of 1977, was a city still in the long, sprawling expansion that was reshaping the South Bay. It was not yet the technology corridor it would become, but it was already a place where people arrived and reinvented themselves, where the geography was vast enough and the population mobile enough that a stranger could move through without leaving much of a mark. The Lion's Den bar sat on Almaden Road, the kind of neighborhood establishment where regulars knew each other, and a new face wasn't unusual. Jeanette was there with friends on the last night of January. She was comfortable, she was among people she trusted, and the evening was ordinary until it wasn't. The man she left with was not identified that night. Her friends gave investigators what they could, a description, a general impression, the memory of a face they had seen for only a short time. San Jose police sketched a composite from those descriptions. They canvassed the area, interviewed everyone connected to the bar, and looked at every angle the evidence offered them. The carport where the VW was found was close enough to the bar that the timeline was tight. Someone had moved fast and then tried to make it permanent with fire, and then left. The car was processed. Evidence was collected. The long-sleeved dress shirt knotted around Jeanette's neck was taken into evidence. Swabs from her fingernails were taken. And inside the car, among Jeanette's belongings, there was a carton of cigarettes. On the surface of that carton, invisible to the kind of processing 1977 could offer, was a thumbprint. No suspect was identified. The sketched composite produced no confirmed match. The case went to the file shelf. The evidence went to storage. Jeanette's son Alan grew up without his mother. Her family carried what families carry when the question is never answered. Not the clean grief of loss, but the open, unresolved weight of not knowing who, and not knowing why, and not knowing if anyone was still paying attention. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office established a cold case unit in 2011. The unit was not built on optimism. It was built on the recognition that forensic science had outgrown the evidence it had once been powerless to read, and that somewhere in the filing cabinets and evidence rooms of the county, there were cases waiting for technology that had not yet existed when the crimes were committed. Deputy District Attorney Rob Baker became one of the prosecutors working those cases. He would later say that Jeanette Ralston's case was one that haunted every cold case prosecutor in the unit, that every one of them had looked at it, dug into it, and come away with the same frustration. The evidence was there. They just hadn't yet found the key that fit the lock. The unit worked through the years after 2011 methodically. They resolved cases, some through DNA, some through witnesses who finally came forward, some through forensic technology that had simply advanced far enough to read what the original investigators could not. The Ralston case was re-examined multiple times. The dress shirt, the fingernail swabs, the physical evidence sealed in 1977. All of it was submitted for modern DNA analysis when the science reached the point where the samples could yield something. A DNA profile was developed from the evidence. It was submitted to CODIS, the National Database of Convicted Offender DNA. It returned nothing. The man who killed Jeanette Ralston in 1977 was not in the system. He was not in the system because he had moved. That detail would become important. At the time of Jeanette's murder, Willie Eugene Sims was a private in the United States Army, assigned to Fort Ord, a military installation in Marina, California on Monterey Bay, about 90 miles south of San Jose. He was young, he was mobile, and he was in California in January of 1977 in a uniform that gave him both access and invisibility. The original investigation had not surfaced his name. He had not been interviewed. He had not appeared on any list. He left the state of California before DNA collection laws could reach him. In 1978, just a year after Jeanette's murder, Sims was convicted in Monterey County for assault with intent to commit murder in a case involving another woman. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. When he was released, he did not remain in California. He moved. Eventually, he settled in Jefferson, Ohio, in Ashtabula County, in the northeastern corner of the state near the Pennsylvania border. He lived there for decades. He built a life in the way that people who have done terrible things and gotten away with them build lives, quietly, incrementally, at a sufficient distance from the place where it happened. The case in Monterey County had resulted in a conviction, but it predated the mandatory DNA collection requirements that would have entered his profile into the national database. He moved before those laws applied to him. He was clean in CODIs, and CODIs was what the investigators had. For more than a decade after the cold case unit was established, the Ralston case sat at the edge of solvable. The DNA was developed, the profile was in the database, but there was no match, because the man was not in the database. And then, in the summer of 2024, Baker and the unit made a decision that changed everything. It was not a technological breakthrough. It was not a new database or a new technique. It was a question asked again, from a different angle. About a year ago, Baker would later say, they decided to have the fingerprints in the case checked again. The thumbprint on Jeanette's cigarette carton had been collected in 1977 and catalogued with the rest of the evidence. It had been examined before without producing a match. Fingerprint databases had expanded enormously in the decades since the murder. Millions of prints had been entered, from criminal cases, from employment background checks, from military service records, from federal applications of all kinds. The print was resubmitted in the summer of 2024, and this time, it came back with a name. Willie Eugene Sims. The thumbprint on the carton of cigarettes sitting inside Jeanette Ralston's Volkswagen Beetle on the night she died matched Willie Eugene Sims, a former Army private who had been stationed at Fort Ord at the time of the murder and had been living in Jefferson, Ohio for years. The fingerprint database had done what CODIS could not. It had found him not because of his DNA, but because of records from his military service. Prints entered into the system from his time in the Army. His hand had touched that cigarette carton, and the record of that hand had been waiting in a database for someone to ask the right question. The fingerprint was the key that opened the door. But it was not enough on its own to charge a man with murder 48 years later. Investigators needed direct biological confirmation. They needed to put his DNA next to the DNA recovered from the crime scene and let science close the distance. Earlier in 2025, prosecutors from the Santa Clara County DA's Bureau of Investigation and detectives from the San Jose Police Department traveled to Ohio. They worked with the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Office to locate Sims and collect a DNA sample directly from him. A swab from his mouth was taken and transported back to California. The Santa Clara County DA's crime lab received the sample and compared it against the DNA profile developed from the evidence collected from Jeanette in 1977. The dress shirt used to strangle her, the swabs taken from under her fingernails, the DNA that had been preserved in storage for 48 years because someone in 1977 had the discipline to collect and catalog what the science of the moment could not yet use. The lab comparison came back. Sims's DNA was consistent with the DNA recovered from the murder weapon and from Jeanette's fingernails. The thumbprint had found him. The DNA confirmed it. The case that had haunted the cold case unit since 2011, the case that Baker would say every prosecutor on the unit had looked at and dug into, had a name attached to it at last. On May 6, 2025, Willie Eugene Sims was arrested in Jefferson, Ohio. He was 69 years old. He was charged with the first-degree murder of Jeanette Ralston, committed on or around February 1, 1977. He was arraigned in Ashtabula County Court and extradited to California. He was arraigned again in San Jose, where he faced one count of murder. If convicted, he faces 25 years to life in prison. The Ashtabula County Sheriff and the county prosecutor released a joint statement. They said they were extremely thankful and proud to be part of the law enforcement partnership that had worked together across state lines to seek justice for Jeanette and her family. Baker called Alan Ralston the morning of the arrest. Alan was the 6-year-old who had grown into a man without his mother, who had spent 48 years living in the shape of what February 1, 1977 had taken from him. Baker told him what they had found, what the fingerprint matched, what the DNA confirmed, who the man was, and where he had been living all these years. Alan Ralston was thankful, Baker said. He told the prosecutor that his birthday was coming up. He said the arrest was a great birthday present. That is what 48 years of waiting distills down to. A birthday present. The profound compressed into the ordinary because the ordinary is the only language left when everything else has been said without resolution for nearly 5 decades. Alan was 6. He is a grown man now. His mother was 24 years old, which is young enough that almost everything she was going to do was still ahead of her. She left a bar on a January night to walk 10 minutes with a stranger and never came back. And her son spent his entire life after the age of 6 carrying that. The birthday gift was not justice, exactly. It was the answer to a question that had been open his whole life. It was the name. And after 48 years, the name was the most important thing that was left to give. The cigarette carton was sitting in evidence storage the entire time, not in a crime lab being analyzed, not on a desk with a detective working it, in storage, cataloged, sealed, preserved through 4 decades of budget cycles and department turnover and cases that crowded in front of it. The thumbprint was on the carton the way it had been since 1977. It took the right question asked at the right moment, a decision to submit the prints again, in a database that now contained his military records, to turn it into the thing it had always potentially been: evidence. Evidence that pointed at a man in Ohio who had been for 48 years, approximately 90 miles from where he committed murder. A long-sleeved shirt knotted around a woman's neck, a thumbprint on a cigarette carton, a fire that failed to catch. These are the objects at the center of this case. The shirt held his DNA. The carton held his print. The fire that was supposed to erase both of those things simply did not work. He left that car thinking he had covered himself. He had not covered himself. He had only bought time. 48 years of it. And the system, when it finally asked the right question, took all of that time back in a single match. Baker told reporters afterward, "We can't bring her back, but we can answer a lot of the questions the family may have had, and we can try to get them some closure, and hopefully justice in that way." Jeanette Ralston was 24 years old. She had a son who was 6. She lived in San Mateo and went to a bar in San Jose on a January night and said she would be back in 10 minutes. She had her whole life in front of her. The man who took it kept living his for 48 years, in a different state, under no suspicion, beyond the reach of the database that was supposed to hold him accountable. until a thumbprint in a system he never thought about asked a question he had no way to answer. As we reach the end of this journey together, I want to thank you for listening, truly. These words mean nothing without the hearts that receive them. And while I am grateful you are here, I also noticed that over 90% of viewers still haven't subscribed. If these stories have ever brought you comfort, reflection, or even a moment of feeling that someone else's truth was worth honoring, please consider subscribing today. It genuinely helps more than you know. And before you leave, tell me, did this story remind you of someone? Share your thoughts in the comments below.